One of the most important things that a fire inspector has to know how to use is the code. Not exactly the most exciting subject in the world. Where do we get law from? But actually, this is really, really important to understand how we use the code, where it comes from. The last thing you want to do is end up in front of a judge and have some lawyer quizzing you about a violation that you wrote somebody up for, and it turns out you were wrong because you used the wrong section of the code or you didn't really have jurisdiction in this kind of place. It would just totally be embarrassing. Now, I never had anybody challenge me in court. Just one time, and that was on a parking ticket. But it's possible, and you just want to make sure that you understand the code, you're using it correctly. So let's look at that today and see what we can learn about law. Back in government class, what was that, your senior year? I don't know, not exactly the favorite, but it is important to understand. So what we're going to look at today is identify the different kinds of codes and the process of making laws. We're going to describe the model code process, identify the major model code groups, and describe how they get that and how it's used by state and local governments and their authority. Well, there's some really important words that you want to make sure that you understand. So you might want to write these down. You can pause this and write it down. Make sure you understand these words. Authority, jurisdiction, AHJ, that's authority having jurisdiction. That talks about the local fire department. Code, statute, regulation, standard, model code, and what it means to adopt or to amend the model code, consensus, it's an important word, ICC, that's the International Code Council from whom we get our model code. NFPA, well, most of you know who that is, the National Fire Protection Agency, from whom in California we get standards. And then SFM, which is the abbreviation for the State Fire Marshal, or here in California we would say the CSFM, or the California State Fire Marshal. Well, let's start with the term jurisdiction. Now, normally we think of jurisdiction as being a geographic area, and that is the most important part of the definition. So let's read this definition here. The geographic area over which authority extends. The legal authority, or the authority to hear and determine causes of action. Jurisdiction generally describes any authority over a certain area or certain persons, and I want to put in there processes. Certain areas, persons, or processes. So in the law, jurisdiction sometimes refers to a particular geographic area containing a defined legal authority. So Ventura County Fire Department has jurisdiction over Ventura County except those cities that are incorporated and have their own fire departments, like I believe Oxnard has their own fire department. Ventura City has their own fire department. So in those areas, Ventura City Fire Department has jurisdiction. But jurisdiction can also refer to processes. So the Environmental Protection Agency has jurisdiction over any issue having to do with the environment. OSHA has jurisdiction over the workplace and safety in the workplace. So there's a little bit more to jurisdiction than just where you are. It might have to do with what you're doing. Another very important word is authority. And sometimes the word authority is used with power. Authority refers to power exercised by a person in virtue of his or her position or jurisdiction or right to command, the legal right or permission to act on behalf of another. So this poor little guy's getting a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, and pretty funny little picture there. But the police have authority to write tickets, to arrest, as long as the person that they're arresting has violated the law. So authority has limitations, but it's given from a higher power. And here in America, the ultimate authority is the government itself, but we give the government the power, right? We elect our officials. So we are a representative government in America. And that representation goes up to our senators, congressmen, presidents, governors, all of these people. And then they give authority down to organizations that they deputize to to exercise power over certain jurisdictions and certain people. Let's look at this next slide. The Greeks, when you read Old Greek literature, they had two words for power. One of them was exousia, which meant authority. So when a policeman says, stop in the name of the law, when he says in the name of the law, he's saying by the authority given to me by the law. So that authority is a right coupled with power to do an act or order others to act. Now that's where that word power in the Greek, also they had a second word, dynamis, or some people might say dunamis. And that's the word, the root word that we get dynamite from in English. And dynamis is force. So the policeman might say, stop in the name of the law, or I'll shoot. You've got authority and you've got power. One is force. So as firefighters, well, we don't carry guns and we don't chop people up with our axes or, tear them down in some way or squirt them down with water. At least we try not to do that. But our dynamis is the pocketbook. We fine people for their violations, and usually that's not the first or even the second notification. It's by the third, fourth, or fifth notification where we will start fining people for not obeying our authority. So where does that authority, where does that power come from? Well, we have a power of inspection in the state of California as firefighters, but let's step back just a little bit further and ask ourselves a couple of questions. What is the source of all law in the United States? Do you know? Ask yourself right now, what is the source of all law in the United States? In fact, let's even bring that here home to California. What's the basis of all law and authority to enforce those laws in California? Then we want to ask ourselves, well, what is meant by the term code? And what is the difference between a code, a regulation, and a standard? Well, let's look at the answers. First of all, the basis of all law in the United States is the Constitution. The Constitution sets up our form of government and how we get laws, which we'll talk about in a second. In California, we have a California state constitution, and it's similar to the Constitution of the United States of America, but it has to do with our state. And all of our laws here in the state of California come from or have to at least be in harmony with that Constitution. Every once in a while, we'll hear about a law that's been passed by the government or through vote, and it goes through the court process, ends up before the Supreme Court, and they deem it unconstitutional. Here in the state of California, we voted on the Marriage Act, that marriage is between a man and woman. And that was unanimously voted into a law here in California quite some time ago, about 8 to 10 years ago, maybe a little more. But that law was challenged. It went before the state Supreme Court, the state court, and it was deemed unconstitutional there. Then it went one more step further, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional, and even though the people had voted for that law, it was done away with. So the laws that we make, either at a legislature level or that we vote for, they still have to agree with the Constitution. Now, here in California, we have a state constitution, so just like the United States. Now, the answer to number 3, well, that's the whole rest of this lecture. What is code? What is the difference between code, standards, and regulations? So, you're out there doing an inspection, just like you're supposed to, and you tell someone that their file cabinet is in the middle of the hallway. You can't have a file cabinet in the hallway. It's blocking the exit path. And then the manager or the principal of the school or whatever responds, well, why? Why do I have to move that out of the way? We got serious problems with space here, and you can get by the cabinet. Come on. So what is your response to him? Well, hopefully your response isn't just because the code says so, even though that's the right answer. It really is the bottom line. What is the answer to that? The code says so. So code says you can't put a file cabinet in an exit path. But, hopefully based on what we learned in the last couple PowerPoints, is that you might give them a better answer, that you might explain the problems when exiting paths are choked up, that yes, you can get by right now, but what if we had a panic situation where a lot of people are trying to get by? That cabinet could make the difference between life and death for some of those people. So, we want to give a good response, but really the right answer is the law says so. So, what is this code? How do you even define the term code? Where do our codes come from? And what happens if someone refuses to obey the code? Well, the answer to that is simply a systematically arranged body of rules. That's the most simple answer to code. Code is any systematically arranged body of rules. Now, there's another part to that definition that isn't written down here, but it's important to understand. It's a systematically arranged body of rules that's written down. It has to be written down. It has to be made official. In fact, when we make any new law, not only is it written down, it is codified when it is written down, signed by the governor or the president, and then goes to the Office of Administrative Law. They look it through, make sure that it's all written correctly, and they put a date on it. And that date will usually be January 1st of the next year. As of January 1st, just after midnight, this is the law. And from that point on, you have to obey it. Put simply, code is a list of rules of what to do or what not to do. Here in California, the Health and Safety Code is the foundational law, and other than the Constitution. Constitution's the foundation, but most of our laws are all written in the Health and Safety Code. Out of the Health and Safety Code comes a whole bunch of other laws. And there's 29 different codes in California, 29 different sets of statutes and laws that have been voted on by our state Congress or by the people. So there are also codes of regulations, and we'll talk about the difference. Here in California, as I said, there's 29 different codes. Civil code, education code, family code, health and safety code, that's the main one, the labor code, the penal code, the vehicle code. Well, how do we get these codes? All law comes out of the Constitution, and in the Constitution it says that we get our laws from our representatives in government. So they are called the legislature, right? We have the federal government legislature and we have the California state legislature. And in there, there's senators and congressmen. And they make most of our laws. At least they originate most of our laws. So how do those laws happen? Well, first of all, some senator or congressman comes up with an idea. And, whatever it might be, let's say, the senator is grossed out by people who pick their nose. And he comes up with this idea, we need to make a law that there's no picking your nose in public, especially when you're in a car at a red light. And so he writes up this law. He doesn't write it. All of his assistants do, right? But he's the originator of the idea. Now, once they've written it all up and made it sound the way they want it to sound, they present it at Congress or at the Senate. And when they do, it gets read out loud on the Senate floor or on the Congress floor, and everybody gets a chance to hear it. Then it gets printed and put out to everybody. But that's not when they vote on it. It goes to committee. Now, in committee, the committees are going to talk about, is this a reasonable law? Is this something that's going to get thrown out of court in the Supreme Court? Or is this something that is worth pressing forward on? And something as silly as no picking your nose in your car when you're at a red light, that committee would get thrown out, wouldn't it? But let's just pretend it didn't. And so it gets through committee. Well, then what do? They take it back out onto the floor and they read it a second time. And maybe in committee they've tweaked it a little bit, changed it a little bit. And after the second reading, there's opportunities for people to tweak it and change it a little bit more. Then finally, it gets a third reading on the floor. After the third reading on the floor, it's time to vote. And they'll call for the vote. And everybody votes. Now, when they vote, it's all counted out. And if it comes to a unanimous or a consensus, that's all they got to have is consensus. One more vote for than against, it becomes law. One more vote against than for, it's nixed, it's done, it's not going to be a law. If it does get that yes vote, then it goes to the governor or to the president's desk. And they have now it has to pass in both the Senate and the Congress, then it goes to the governor or the president. Now, the governor or the president can do what? They can say no, and then what do they call that? A veto. So they have veto power, and they can say, no, I'm not going to sign it. Now, is that the end of it if they say no? Well, you can override a veto. But these days, with an almost 50-50 split in our country and in our houses of representatives, that's not going to happen because it takes a 2/3 vote to override a veto. So no longer just one more than the other. It's got to be 2/3 veto against a third not against the veto. So that's a big deal. It's probably not going to happen. So President Obama, during the end of his administration, he vetoed a lot of laws that, he just wouldn't vote for them. And it was impossible to override his veto. So, with the present situation, that doesn't happen much. But that's how we get our statutes, okay? I want you to understand, every law that comes out of the legislature is a statute. Now, how do we get all these other laws? Well, we get them from another process, but that starts with the statute. So let's go to the next slide. The legislature makes statutes giving authority to different agencies. So they give authority to these regulatory agencies, and they tell them to make administrative laws or regulations applying to their area of authority. So a law was passed giving them the authority to make more laws. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but that is how it works. So let's look at the next slide. What is a regulation? Do regulations have the same effect as all other laws or all statutes? And what's the difference between a regulation and a statute? Well, regulations are rules that are designed to implement a statute based on the agency's interpretation of the statute. So the legislature makes a law called a statute, and they give in that law the regulatory agency an authority to then make laws applying to their jurisdiction. Regulations are related to regulatory agencies. That's one way to remember it. So as firefighters, what regulatory agency are we concerned about? The state fire marshal. They're the regulatory agency that makes laws based on the authority given to them by the state. So they place on them that authority, and that authority, and notice places or processes, and I didn't include the word people here, places, people, or processes over which they have jurisdiction or authority. So a regulation is a rule adopted by a state regulatory agency to implement, interpret, or make specific the law enforced or administered by it, or to govern its procedure. A regulation has the same force of law as the statutes once they are legally adopted. So that regulatory agency goes back to the legislature and says, here's the laws you told us to make. They look at them and they say, okay, good. And they pass it on to the Secretary of State, and it goes through the Office of Administrative Law. They take it to the governor. He signs it. Boom. It's law, just like the statutes, but a different process. So a statute, look at that last line, a statute is a law passed by a legislature. A regulation, for the most part, by definition, is a law made by a regulatory agency based on the authority they got by a statute. Okay, it's kind of crazy, but that's how it works. So the state fire marshal was given authority to make laws. And in our other PowerPoint and little project today, we're going to look at Title 19 and the authority that's, and laws, regulations that are therein. So law is a big term that is an umbrella term about all the different kinds of laws. Code is a big term that basically any written down law. But regulation is a law that relates to a regulatory agency. And later we'll talk about standards and what those are. So by what authority can an agency adopt regulations? The regulatory agency receives its power to adopt laws from the statutes. Our elected officials gave them the authority. So this authority is going to be cited either at the beginning or the end of those regulations, and that's the case in Title 19. Now, we talked about this a little bit before, but it's very important that we understand. So as firefighters, we have a lot of different laws that we might enforce. First of all, federal laws. we have to be familiar with those federal laws that apply to the fire service and in fire prevention. And can we make those more lenient? Nope, nope, nope. Only more strict. So the only way we can change federal law is to make it stricter at a state level or at a local level. Then we also have to enforce the state laws, which have the most power here in California for all of the areas of California, even in the counties and cities. So we also have, like Ventura County Code, LA County Code, city statute or city code of regulations, county ordinances, city ordinances, all of these things can apply, but they have to, that same trickle down effect. You can't change state law to be more lenient locally. It has to be stricter. We've already talked about that. I just wanted to reiterate it. And also, we have to understand technical codes. We're going to talk about that in a second, but the building code, the fire code, the mechanical or the plumbing code. Now, wait a minute. I thought you just talked about the state fire marshal code. Well, there's actually a different technical code that's called the California Fire Code. So there's a difference between the California State Fire Marshal's Code of Regulations and the California Fire Code. We'll talk about that in a second. Well, where does the authority come from? Well, the authority comes from the 10th Amendment. And this is kind of important to understand that when it comes right down to it, the states have power that were given to them by the Constitution. So the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. So the states have a lot of power. The states have police power. They can restrain our personal freedoms and our property rights when it's for the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. So how can the CHP stop traffic on the freeway? Come on, we got somewhere to get going. Well, they can do it when it's for the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Just up the road, a big bunch of metal fell off of a truck, and they're stopping everybody so that metal can be taken off of the road so that nobody gets in a car accident. So that power is there. So what that police power is possessed by the states. Before the Constitution, the states had all the power. When we became a United States of America, the Constitution gave more power to the federal government, but also there was a power that remained with the states, and that was reserved to them by the 10th Amendment. Well, later on, there are some arguments about who has the power. Does the local city have the power? Does the state have the power? Does the United States have the power? And, you know, we fought a civil war over this, that the U.S. federal government ultimately has the highest power. But the states have the next highest power. And there was this Supreme Court case back in the 1800s, and the ruling that came down was called Dillon's Rule, based on a Supreme Court justice named John Forrest Dillon. And basically, this case was between local governments and the state government. Does the state government have the right to tell local cities that they can or can't do certain things? Well, according to Dillon's Rule and the ruling of the Supreme Court, is local governments are instruments of the state. So the power is with the state. And the only power at local governments and local ordinance and local rule charters are those that are granted to them by the state. So those not expressly granted don't exist. In other words, what we said earlier, even at the local level, local law cannot supersede state law. If the state says you got to do things a certain way, we've got to do it in our city, even if we don't like it. So what have we learned so far? First of all, we've seen that all federal laws applying to fire and life safety can only be made stricter as they come from the federal government to the state and from the state to local jurisdictions. We also learned a little while ago that when it comes to federal property, though, we can't use our stricter laws. Secondly, the state of California has by statute given the state fire marshal authority to make codes and regulations, which is called Title 19, the State Fire Marshal Code of Regulations. That's one of the main sets of laws that fire prevention inspectors are going to use. But there's one more major code concerning fire prevention, and that's called the California Fire Code, Title 24, Part 9. Well, where do we get that one from? We get it from the Model Code. It's developed by an organization called the International Code Council. Now, this comes through a different process, so you got to track with me. If you've fallen asleep, wake up right now, okay? Wake up, okay. The Model Code is developed by the International Code Council, the ICC. And they make this code through a consensus process. And they have all of these members. I'm a member of the International Code Council. Masood, who teaches here and is the Ventura County Fire Marshal, is a member of the International Code Council. But who would you think would want to have a say-so in laws having to do with buildings and fire-related stuff? Well, fire chiefs, architects, contractors, engineers, the plumbers union, the carpenters union, all of these people want to have a say-so in the laws. And they end up becoming members of the ICC, and many of them get involved in committees. And in these committees, they talk about the laws. And hey, maybe we've been too strict here and we don't need to do that. Or hey, the latest statistics are showing we're not making a wide enough aisle for people to get out of. We need to change that. And so they get together every 3 years. It's a 3-year process. So they get together, they look at the code, they get in technical committees, and they review it. When they are done reviewing it, they make a consensus vote. And when they vote on it, then that's going to be their model code for the next 3 years. So what do they do with that? Well, they present it to all the state governments and local governments for adoption. So the state of California takes that model code and votes on it at the legislature and adopts it. Now, before they do that, they give it to the building officials and the fire code officials, the state fire marshal of the state of California, who look through it and they say, we like it, but we don't like everything. We might want to make some changes, and they call those amendments. We'll talk about that in the section. So it's really important that you understand that the model code is made by a private organization called the International Code Council, is put together every 3 years, then they present it to the governments. But when they present it to the government, it's just a proposed law. So it's very important you understand this. No model code carries the force of law until it is, big, bold letters this should be, adopted by a legislative body, such as the state assembly or a city council that's empowered to enact laws or ordinances. Once it's adopted by the legislative body, then they put a year on it, and at the beginning of the next year, that model code now becomes the state of California's fire code. And now it assumes the full force of law. So adopting it is what makes it law. Voting on it and saying, we like this set of proposed laws and we're going to make it the law. But what about those things where, in some states are different? If you live in Florida, you've got different situation than we have in California. California has what? We have earthquakes. Florida has hurricanes. I remember my friend Steve Schreiber was having his house built, and he was describing to me some stuff going on as his home was being built. And he goes, well, tomorrow they're going to be strapping the house down. And I said, strapping the house down? What the heck is that? Well, they literally have straps that tie into rebar that goes into the foundation and the footings. And these straps go up and around all of the framing and the roof, and then go back to the other side and strap down to the foundation on the other side of the building. And these straps are meant to hold the roof on in case of a hurricane or tornado. Now, we don't have anything like that here in California. But you know what? After the Northridge earthquake, we changed a whole bunch of our laws, and we amended the building code and the fire code to be more conducive with a place where buildings get shaken really, really hard. So a modern home has what we call shear walls, where we nail or screw plywood to all of the framing to make it more unified and to stand together and to not twist, but to move as a unit when the earthquake shakes. So these are called amendments. So locally, we might say here in California, yes, the model code says that a building has to be built with framing, and one wall on every building has to have shear walls. Well, they amended that, and they said in California, all 4 walls have to have shear walls. So at this point, though, here's what's interesting. This is not coming from the federal government. It's coming from a model code organization. So we can make it more lenient or more stringent. This is the exception, because it's not coming from the higher authority. It's coming from the model code agency. So we can make it less strict as well as more strict. Then, once the state of California votes on it, now it's state law. And the local governments can amend again, but now that lenient thing, no, you can't do that, because this is coming from a higher authority. All you can do is make it stricter, never more lenient. And if you do make it stricter, you got to have a reason. You can't just say, no, we just want to make it harder here. No, there's got to be a reason why you believe that it should be stricter. So you've got to rationalize it. Well, where do these model codes come from? They come from 2 agencies. There's 2 major agencies that make these model codes, the International Code Council and the NFPA. Now, originally, the NFPA was going to be a part of the International Code Council, and they decided not to. They wanted to be able to make money off of selling their code. Well, poor NFPA, only 8 states in the whole United States buy their version of the building code, the fire code, and other major codes. Sorry, I had to take a drink of water there. So right around when I was a fire prevention inspector, this process was happening. Before I became an inspector, here in California, we had the Uniform Building Code, and it came from BOCA, the Building Officials and Code Administration International. And then there was ICBO, the International Conference of Building Officials, and they published building and fire codes. And then there was the Southern Building Code Congress International. You know what? I think that the Uniform Code came from ICBO, not BOCA. But those 3 agencies and the NFPA originally decided that they were going to make just one code instead of 4 separate kinds of code. So in 1994, they made the decision that they were going to stop publishing their own codes after 1999. So right around 2003, 2004, they started cooperatively publishing the I codes. The NFPA backed out and they decided to do their own thing. So those three organizations merged in 2002, and then in right around then they made their first published code that came out, and California adopted it. And you can see a more recent version, the 2013 California Fire Code here, California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 9. That's our fire code for the state of California. Not the State Fire Marshal Code, that's different. That's Title 19. So the NFPA, now, because we don't buy their building code and fire code, are they just out of the picture for us? No. We use them for standards, and we'll talk about that in a second. So how does this ICC code process happen? Well, I'm going to put a handout on the on Canvas for you that you can look at. But the code changes are submitted by any interested party. Then it goes to technical committees like we talked about before, and they hear testimony and discuss this at code hearings. Then they make the changes, and they're approved as submitted or modified or denied by floor amendment. Then the general membership gets the chance to vote on it after it comes out of committee. And the changes then are approved and will be included in the next printing of the code, reprinted every 3 years. In 2013 was the most current. I should change that, because now 2016 is the most current. Now, when governments vote on it, they have two ways of adopting it. They can do it by transcription, but that's just dumb. Literally, they take the whole code and rewrite it into their laws. Well, that just seems a waste. What we do here in California is we adopt it by reference. Our governing body asks the state fire marshal, hey, you like this? Ask the building officials, hey, you like this? They say, yeah, we like it. And so they vote on it. And they adopt it by statute. They vote on it, they make it law, and all they do is they adopt it by reference. So they will vote on it, and they'll have a law that says, we accept as State Fire Code, Title 24, Part 9, the 2016 edition, as amended, right, because we add amendments, and as of January 1st of 2016, it will become our new fire code. And so that's how we get it. But we need to remember that fire inspectors use many different codes. So the three main codes that we use is Title 24, Part 2, and Part 9. Part 2 is the building code. We do use the building code, though most of it applies to the building official and the building inspectors. But some of it applies to us. And of course, we use California Fire Code Part 9, which is Title 24, Part 9, which is the California Fire Code. Now, there's 2 chapters in both of those that are exactly the same. And you might want to remember this. Chapter 9, which is fire protection systems, and Chapter 10, which is exiting, which we're going to look at both of those chapters later in this semester. They are exactly the same in the building code and the fire code. Now, what's that other code we use? Title 19, the California State Fire Marshal Code. So those are our 3 main codes. Title 24, Part 2, which is the building code, kind of use that a lot, but the other 2 very much use a lot, Title 24, Part 9, and the State Fire Marshal Code, Title 19. Well, what about the poor NFPA? We kicked them out when we said, we're not buying your code. Well, the NFPA maintains over 300 codes, standards, and recommended practices. They started by, all the way back in 1896, they were a stock insurance company, and they put out standards for sprinklers. And that standard is still to this day called NFPA 13. It's been changed a lot since 1896, but it is a standard which tells us how to build things. So the standards can be enforced by reference. So what it'll say in the fire code is this type of building must have sprinklers built according to NFPA Standard 13. So as I said earlier, NFPA, we don't use them for building code or fire code, and they develop their own I codes. And only 8 states are using them: Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maryland, West Virginia, and Florida. But in California, we use them for these standards. NFPA 72 is the alarm standards. NFPA 13 is how to build a sprinkler system. So the code, very important, the code tells us what to do. The standards tell us how to do it. Now, do the standards have the force of law? Yes, because they're referenced in the law. So when the code says you got to build it, oh, and by the way, you have to build it this way, according to the standards in NFPA 13 or NFPA 24 or 25, whatever it might be. So if the California code, fire code, tells us every school over 6 students has to have an alarm system, which it does, we would look to the NFPA Standard 72 as to how to build that system. Believe it or not, we're almost done. So, in summary, in the United States, most of our laws come through statutes, but our model code, it's only 100 years old, this process, but our BOCA, ICBO, and SBCCI consolidated and made the ICC. And the ICC gives us our model code. We vote on it at a state level, and it becomes the California Fire Code. The NFPA also develops a set of codes, but we don't use those here. But we do use their standards. So the ICC is used by 42 states, NFPA by 8 states. They both develop model codes, but we use the standards and recommended practices by the NFPA. Both of them are made through a consensus process, but they have to be adopted at a state or local level. They can be amended per the state demographics and specific needs, and they can be amended again at the local level, but now it can only be made stricter. Whew, we got through it. Okay, that was a lot. You still need to look at the Title 19 PowerPoint and the project that goes with that. Do that next as soon as you can. Okay, thanks guys for your patience. They should get shorter from this point on, okay? Thanks a lot.